Hello? Yeah, I'm here to discuss some of the differences between the evangelical and Catholic views regarding the Apostle Peter. Although most evangelicals put a large amount of emphasis on Peter and recognize him as one of the leaders of the early Christian church, most of these evangelicals don't believe that Peter had much more power than any other evangelist, like the evangelists that are on TV today or the evangelists that are at the local churches preaching. By contrast, the Catholic view of Peter is much stronger, and it's a belief that Peter had actual powers that go far beyond what a person would have who simply believes in Christ and preaches the gospel. It's not so much belief that Peter himself was a great guy with few sins or anything like that, but a belief that Christ chose Peter for a certain task and did not choose other people for that same task. And much of this Catholic belief is based on Matthew 16:18-19, those verses. And there's a lot of controversy over whether Peter was the rock on which the church would be built, where Christ is talking to Peter. Actually, Peter's name was Simon or Shimon at the time, and Christ said, upon this rock I will build my church. And there are many Bible verses where the word rock refers to Christ. They refer to Christ as the rock. But in these verses, Christ was speaking, and he did not say anything like, I am the rock. He did not identify the rock as being himself. Instead, in those verses, Christ was not celebrating his own glory. He wasn't magnifying himself. Instead, he was congratulating Peter, the apostle Simon or Shimon. And those verses were mainly dealing with the greatness of Simon, Shimon, or Peter, because he had recognized Christ's glory and greatness. So it was implying that Peter was great because he was the one who had recognized Christ's greatness. So although Peter was not as great as Christ, he was still great according to those verses. Those verses were celebrating him. And even if Peter was not the rock on which the church was built, it doesn't change the fact that those verses show that Christ would give the keys to the kingdom of heaven to Peter. And I've looked many parts of the Bible and looked at evangelical literature and whatever things that supposedly would show that Peter's power was no greater than that of other apostles. And I have not seen any verses where anyone other than Peter was to receive the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Even the other apostles did not receive those powers. Now, there are verses where all the apostles, including Peter, received the power of binding and loosening, and that they could let out various powers and stuff because of their apostolic power that they received at the Great Commission and at Pentecost and so forth. And so the apostles, including Peter, had various powers. Yet Peter was the only one that I see which was to receive the keys to the kingdom of heaven. That sounds like a pretty powerful thing to receive. I don't see any other set of keys other than those that were given to Peter or Simon or Shimon, whatever we prefer to call him. So even if he's not the rock on which the church was built, we would still have to say that he was the leader because he had the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And so we look at that. And ironically, one of my fascinations with Peter occurred about 6 or 7 months before I was starting to think about becoming a Catholic. I started looking at Peter because one day I was watching an evangelical pastor on TV, and the pastor was condemning witchcraft. And he cited the Bible verse where Peter rebukes the Simon, the magician. Okay, and Peter rebuked him and all that. And so I looked at those verses and showed Peter had a lot of power there, and it looked like more power than the average Christian could have, because it was as if Peter could see Simon's motives and all that, and Peter was ruling over the church. And this went against the evangelical notion, which says that each local group can choose its own pastor. If each local group could choose its own pastor, then Simon the magician could choose some local church that rejected Peter's authority. And then they could have a Christian church where Simon the magician would be okay. He wouldn't have to listen to Peter. But clearly, according to the Bible, Peter had that authority and rebuked Simon the magician. And that got me looking at Peter's powers and the apostolic powers in general. And that kind of ties in with the verses in Matthew 16, 18, 19. Just look at those verses and show that Jesus was congratulating Peter and showing Peter's greatness, even though Peter's greatness wasn't as great as Jesus' greatness. And so in those verses it would seem that the rock would not have been Jesus, but even if the rock were Jesus, Peter received the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And so it seems clear that a person needs some sort of approval from Peter in order to get into heaven, because Peter having the keys, which could unlock the door or keep the door to heaven shut. So it would be a good idea for someone to join a church that puts high esteem on Peter, that way of meeting Peter's approval. That might be kind of an allegorical way of saying it, but I would feel better being in a church that puts a lot of influence on Peter, because he received the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So